Well, welcome everybody to our second Enbridge Research in Action. I want to thank Enbridge for their support of this series, and we have a great one yet again. I do want to start by welcoming you on behalf of the University of Calgary and Haskayne, and take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. I would also like to note that the University of Calgary is situated on the land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and that the traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohkinstsis, which we now call the City of Calgary. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. If you look at your tables, you'll also see a couple of pamphlets. One of them, of course, is our trusty feedback card. We hope you'll fill that out before you leave today. I'll remind you before the end. We also have how you can get involved with the Center for Corporate Sustainability at the University of Calgary, who put these on. And we also have an itinerary of all the Enbridge Research in Action events and all the ConocoPhillips Iris events that will be upcoming for this year. We're 3 in, and we've got 7 to go. So there's 10 in total. So we hope that we'll welcome you back. I also wanted to mention that the University of Calgary had a great event occur where we kicked off our Indigenous strategy, and we were gifted with a Blackfoot name, and I wanted to share that with you today. That name is Itapotop, which means together in a good way. So we're excited that that's happened, and very blessed for us to have received that through a traditional ceremony. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about water. Originally, this topic was put forward by people who attended our ConocoPhillips Iris seminar with John Fennell, who's here today. Thank you for coming, John. And you wanted to hear more. And we had in the audience that day a very special guest who's here, who will be our speaker today, and that is Dr. Kim Sturgis, who's the founder and CEO of Alberta WaterSmart, a services organization committed to improving water management through better technologies and practice. For over 12 years, how time flies, we were talking about that earlier. Yeah. She has led the development of collaborative watershed management models and systems in industry and in government. She has served on boards of the Alberta Chamber of Resources, Council of Canadian Academics, Alberta Water Council, Canadian Academy of Engineering, National Research Council, and the Alberta Economic Development Authority. She has a degree in engineering physics from Queen's University, an MBA from Western, and an honorary doctorate of science from Queen's as well. But most notably, she is a member of the Order of Canada. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kim Sturgis.
Well, it's great to be here today and look out and see so many familiar faces, my board members, former, past, folks that work with us, funders, clients, collaborative partners, and all those that have helped us on our watershed work over so many years. So I know that a lot of you have heard this before, so I'm hoping that you'll enjoy it a second or third time through, and you can always comment on it as well. So thanks so much for giving me this opportunity to talk about water, and the overall theme is thinking globally, planning regionally, and acting locally. So water issues are very complex. People always wonder, why is water different from energy? Water issues are very complex. You need water for people, you need water for industry, we need water for food, and we need water for our environment. And particularly, water is shared and owned by states, so it actually crosses boundaries. It's very different from other resources because it's emotional. Water is very personal. And it's my new favorite story. It really sucks when it's you. So many of you know, we had a really bad water issue in my house in April, caused by upstream water from my neighbor flowing into my house. And it's not happy, and when it's you, it's very personal and it's very upsetting. As my colleague Laura will know, having to cover for me for hours and hours and days of being at home, cleaning up the water mess. So it really is very, very personal. Watershed impacts, they're highly localized, so they tend to be very much in one place. There's a big debate on water as a human right. And that's a very, very difficult one. And there's emergence of groups called water protectors. So there's a lot of issues, and the pipeline folks see this quite a lot. The issue may or may not have much to do with the water, but it always ends up being a water issue. So Throughout this, I'll always talk about the personal impacts of water on me because it's personal, and that's a very important thing to remember. So on the bottom there, that picture on the right is the mighty Athabasca River, where we spend 27 summers camping right in front of that spot. The other thing is that water is fluid. So everything is connected. Water, everything is connected. It's got a natural cycle. It, as we mentioned, crosses political boundaries. And the other one, and Dr. Fennell is here to talk about the groundwater, it moves very differently from surface water. So you have water on the surface and you have water under the surface, and they may or may not have any relationship to each other, but sometimes they do. Climate is water and water is climate. So this is something I think we've seen here in Alberta over the last, certainly last couple of years, that there's a really strong link between climate change and water. And, you know, so if water's contributed to the view that mitigation is about carbon, then adaptation is about water. We've seen a lot of focus on the mitigation side, GHG reduction, and a lessening of potentially looking at adaptation, which is about water, it's local, and it's about action, and it's needed now. Just last Thursday, I got some indication again from the department that we're going to be able to see that swing coming back now toward adaptation and looking at a more coherent approach to water. So let's see if that happens. We'll talk more about that later. We can really expect more extreme weather events. Some of the work that we've done with Dr. David Sachin from the University of Regina, he takes tree ring data and correlates that with stream flows. And he's produced some really interesting graphs over many years. So this shows a reconstructed South Saskatchewan, which is the basin we're in. We're in the Bow Basin. And it shows these reconstructed flows for the last 1,000 years. And what's really interesting is that if we look at the last 60 years or so, things have been really stable, and most of the infrastructure that has been built has been in the last 60 to 80 years, and in a very stable time. Historically, there has been a lot more fluctuation. So if we look at, I don't know how this is going to work, but if we look at this kind of time in here, this is when James Palliser came across the plains and declared that Alberta was unlivable. Nobody could ever live here. And yet, just 30 years later, 40 years later, we had one of the worst floods on the Bow, which is about 1885 at the Bow River, one of the biggest peaks. So these kinds of ups and downs are quite common. And another really interesting one is if I had an opportunity to look at similar research where they'd overlaid California on this, and this graph looks very similar to, you know, the southwest states and the same kinds of major drought events that cause, you know, extinction of some of the folks in the plains there. So this is not just an Alberta event. We are going to see more extreme weather events. Even if nothing else happened, we would see them. I'm the nerdiest engineer in the world. Most folks would know that, I think. But I think that technology is part of the solution, but it's not the only solution. There is no silver bullet. This cartoon came from our Australian colleagues during the shortage that they had in Australia. But we have to look at more holistic solutions. Scale is absolutely critical in water. So we think about it globally, we plan for it regionally, we act locally. The document on the left side of the screen there, Charting Our Water Future, was done by the 2030 Global Water Resources Group about 5 years ago, and I think it's the best summary of what the water situation is globally. It was done by my former company, McKinsey & Company, a very thorough assessment and very balanced. So if you're interested in the global scene, I would recommend that as a pretty balanced assessment. Regionally in our province, as you probably know, we've got 7 major water basins, and all the planning is done on a basin by basin basis. But you have to act locally. So again, on the personal note, this is flood night, standing on the edge of the Elbow River, looking out over the escarpment, and this is the Coal Pits Ranch that was founded in around 1880, and it's It survived, but that's what it looked like. So you really, these are very localized effects. Just as an anecdote, the next morning, we're sitting up on our deck looking out, brilliant, absolute sunshine, golfers golfing by like nothing had ever happened, and just, 14 hours before, this would look like that, and it's literally a kilometer, not even a kilometer away. So it's very, very localized. Global water resources are finite. There's a lot of numbers that are done this way, thinking about things globally, that 2.5% of the water in the world is fresh water. You kind of break it down into groundwater and water that's in the glaciers, and by the time you work it all down to water that you can actually use on an annual basis that replenishes, Dr. Sasha Zender would say that's about 12,500 cubic kilometers per year. So I know what a kilometer is. I can kind of mentally get my head around a cubic kilometer, and that doesn't sound like a lot. And I think that's pretty consistent with research that's been done. There's not a lot of flowing water that you can actually use. How that water is used, so there's water that comes out and something's done to it and the water goes back. For example, people, right? In cities, we take the water out, 90 to 95% of it goes back. We're very efficient processors of water, and it goes back in. And on that basis, agriculture uses about 2/3 of the water, and power, which is power production, uses water but doesn't consume it. And you can see that. But the consumption, the actual water that comes out that can't be used, 93% of that is used in agriculture. So, and that, that's a pretty staggering number, that much of our water is actually used. In Alberta, we'll come to that in a minute, it's a little bit less than that, but this is what the average is around the world. So if that's the water case, so thinking about the average global food print, water is used to make food, and that's the whole point. And if we look at where that water goes, we have things like cabbage and wheat and stuff that actually use not very much water to produce a kilogram of product. If we go up on the far left-hand side, though, beef, and my folks made me put this one in, John Van Ham's your wife, Megan, chocolate, okay. She's a chocolate fanatic, but you look at how much water it takes to produce a kilogram of chocolate. It's extremely high. So I love this piece by McKinsey. 3 billion people are joining the global consumer class over the next 2 decades. As we get more GDP rises in these countries, people are eating more of these products. They're eating beef, they're eating chocolate, and they're consuming a lot more water. 40% of the increase in protein consumption in the last 20 years has been in China as they've raised their standard of living. So if that's happening, we can see that we're going to start to see some water scarcity issues. Around 2050, 9 billion people, these numbers vary a bit, but it's in that time frame when you see that 12,500 cubic kilometers of water per year becomes the place where the water needed to produce the food collide. And that's where that analysis comes from, to say that's when we could run out of water. So these water stresses, of course, they do vary across different basins. So some are already, such as India, of course, already under stress. But as a whole, at an average, that's where that 9 billion 2050 number comes from. We also have water quality issues. I think the Flint, Michigan one is the classic sort of local one. And obviously indigenous provision of water for indigenous communities. So these water issues are very important as well on quality. So the real issue here is not do we have enough water, but do we have enough water to grow the food that we need? And the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations puts out a report. I think they've just produced a more updated one. But basically it's back to this 2050 number that the rising population and incomes, which means you're going to be eating more chocolate, are expected to call for 70% more food production globally and 100% in developing countries relative to 2009 levels. And this is my quote: the largest contribution to increases in agricultural output will come from intensification of production on existing agricultural land. So where food is already being made, that's what we're going to see. So if we look at Canada, Canada is one of the 5 sort of bread baskets of the world. You've got the US and Australia, Argentina and France, and then Canada. But these are your bread baskets of the world. And the water that we have in Canada is going into the food, and then we're exporting that food. And I love this. I never change I find it fascinating that the US Department of Energy is doing this analysis. But if we look at food yield changes to 2050, and that's taking into account changes in soil, changes in climate, Canada, of all of those, is the only one, and specifically in Western Canada, where we can expect to see the ability to grow more food, the ability to actually yield more food, is right here where we are. And so this is the big policy challenge for Alberta, and we've been working for some time now on that water, energy, food nexus project. That really is the interconnectedness of the food and the energy and the water and how we can take care of our environment and our people. This really is the clash of policy that we see here in Alberta. If you want to know more on this, you can actually go to our albertawater.com site /nexus. There's some amazing work going on there in terms of how to see how these trade-offs matter to you and what you can do to influence them. So Canada's blessed with great water resources. We always talk about 20% of the fresh water, about 70% of the renewable resources. My dog Chinook looking at the mighty Athabasca River, just so you know, Jasper. This is an old slide, but I had to pull it back. But there is a perception that we squander this water in our resource extraction. And I keep these 2 quotes, one of them from Rob Renner, who was at the time the Minister of Environment. You know, wild, unregulated pillaging of the environment at the expense of the First Nations is what the Europeans think of us. Well, that was in 2010, and that was kind of a bold statement. Well, it's pretty clear that that's what they think, right? So I think and the other one is the investment partners trying to steer investment people away from investments in oil sands and coal technologies. And this was in 2010, and this is exactly what we have seen. So I thought that was somewhat prophetic. And the consequences to the economy are pretty significant. Now, I keep showing this slide because I cannot bring myself to change the president's picture. But I am going to have to do that at some point. But any case, that's Keystone XL, right? That passed another hurdle. But that, this was around water issues in the Nebraska area, Trans Mountain. And my favorite, the one on the right, I believe this is a young lady, Queen's lady, can't believe it, who's actually chained herself with a bike kind of a lock thing to a valve station on the Enbridge Line 9 reversal because she was upset about that. So, and it was all about contamination of groundwater or headwaters, surface water for them. The other one I've put is this COSIA. The bottom picture there is actually March of 2012 when COSIA was launched. Now, the executives are there. Judy Fairburn was not a CEO of all that, but you look at those 13 people, there's only one left who's in his position. Okay, so there's lots of consequences to our economy. Total, basically gone. ConocoPhillips has sold a lot of their resources. Statoil, gone. So I think there are some pretty serious BP. So if we look now at the water issues across Alberta, so we've talked about the global, now getting into the regional. Water issues do vary a lot across Alberta. Got to update this slide to put a big industrial piece here around the sort of Grand Prairie area as well. But we do have industrial issues in the north. We have agriculture in the south. We have our water towers of the Canadian Rockies. That's Kim's Swimming Hole in Jasper, and then our beautiful landscapes. So interesting thing on this slide is that big orange-red piece you see in the middle of, that's where James Palliser declared, nobody will ever live here. 66% of the irrigated land in Canada is in that red and orange. 66% of the irrigated land in Canada is in that one area. So when we look at what the consumption is, not surprisingly, and again, this number comes up again, about 2/3 of our water is consumed in agriculture, virtually all of it in irrigation. 65% is irrigation, 2% is feedlots and other agricultural uses. So we've had about 10 billion cubic meters a year of water allocation, and it's been pretty steady over the last 10 years. The only small shift was a little bit less in the agriculture and a little bit of increase in the petroleum. And that actually has been because of the onset of like a lot of SAGD production came on at that particular time. And it actually moved that dial slightly. I think it was from 1.18 to 0.27 in terms of oil and gas use. So one thing about the irrigators, so these people say, oh, all these farmers, nasty farmers use all the water. Farmers are very smart, so never count a farmer out. They are very smart people. And they've reduced their water use. They've improved their efficiency by about 30%. I was a water council member and watched this very carefully. They've really improved their efficiency in water use. They've used it to produce more food. And given my first part of my talk, good for them, because that's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to figure out how to make more food here in Alberta. Flood's no stranger. This is from 1929. I love this one. And this could have been from, June 2013, right? They look the same. Very, very interesting. And drought as well. The 2001, 2002 type area was extremely bad for us from a drought point of view. And in fact, the milk system, James is here from down in that area, down in the south, had very bad drought conditions this year. And we can expect to see more of that. There are big financial impacts on businesses. So when the water becomes scarce, the way the water licensing works is more senior licenses get to keep doing what they're doing, but the temporary licenses get pulled back. And so in 2015, temporary diversion licenses were pulled back for hydraulic fracturing operations, even for agricultural use, irrigation use in the Western Irrigation District. You have to do things like on-site water storage to be able to deal with ups and downs. And finally, the one I'm quite interested in, of course, my ARATCO friends are here today. This is Battle River. But, you have to actually shut down production of your power plant because there isn't enough water to be able to make it work at some critical times. So if we look at the business leaders, what they're seeing, the World Economic Forum lists their risks by impact. And water started out in 2013 on the green, which is an environmental risk, is a water supply crises. Now in 2017, 4 of the 5 major risks are water-related, and water is now a societal risk as opposed to an environmental risk. So this is getting more and more serious, and these risks are higher than financial crises, and any of the other financial risks. These risks are higher. So businesses are looking for solutions. This is talking to the business school. So the respondents to the CDP water survey, companies can respond and put in what they think their biggest risks are and what their opportunities are. And they've identified things like water stress, scarcity, flooding, drought, quality, and regulatory uncertainty, and that's where we're going to finish here. But as well as key opportunities like new goods and services or cost savings through efficiency measures and supply chain resilience. And actually the agricultural guys, this is something that they're really doing. I hope Agrium gets their supercluster application because this is going to be a very big issue for supply chain resilience in our food chain, which again, I think is really critical. Water physical risks, I think these are interesting, the kind of physical risk of just not having enough water available. The semiconductor industry in California, they could lose $200 million in revenue just 3 months of no water. And we know what happens up in the oil sands, and coke. There's a regulatory risk. So I'm going to come back and talk about this one at the end, but there is a risk to changing regulations and how might that affect industry and business. And I'm going to come back to that one. And reputational risk. And anybody from Nestle? I don't think so. I'm always curious about the Nestle one because I think Peter Berrybeck, I had the opportunity to talk to him once. He's the chairman of Nestle, And I said, well, Peter, the bottled water thing, really, everybody knows me, knows that I hate bottled water, okay? So, and Peter, and he said, Kim, it's only 0.2% of the world's drinkable water. Well, Peter, it's 0.2% of the world's drinkable water. Like, that's a lot, right? Anyway, so Nestle continues to have that reputational issue, and in fact, Peter Brabeck is now a big supporter of getting rid of bottled water, which is kind of interesting. But it can impact your reputation. So one of the things that we were able to do some work with, COSIA actually, was looking at how to start evaluating risks and responses. So looking at valuing water based on the risks, on the costs of taking actions to mitigate the risks. So if you go out and interview someone and say, what do you think the value of water is? Well, it's infinite, right? Of course, you can't put a price on it. But if you actually talk to a business operation and say, okay, let's say you didn't have water for an entire year, what impact would that have on your operation? Then you can start to say, okay, well, what would the alternatives be? Well, now I can start to figure out what that cost is, and maybe it's worth me investing in those alternatives as a backup plan in case something does happen, and then that starts to get a value on your water. We were able to do this. This was a technique developed by our partners Veolia. And it allowed us to monetize risk based on root cause of origin of problems and probabilities. So this is how we're thinking about value of water. And just to give you kind of a rough, and this is very rough, very generic, but it's about $12 a cubic meter. I mean, if you actually strip away your operation making oil, it's in that range of about $12 a cubic meter. And that's the cost of actually moving the water around and cleaning it, replacing it, and having your backup plans in case something goes wrong. So, approximately. So the other big thing that we're involved in here in Alberta that we really value is collaboration. And many of you here have been involved in a number of these collaborative projects over the years. The Alberta Innovates has really been a big supporter of this work. They've put in quite a bit of funding for many projects on the future water supply and watershed management. In the south, which is where we've started, because this collaborative work actually came out of the 2000 to 2002 drought, and how to look at better ways to move and consider water and look for resilient watersheds. So you can actually go online at albertawatersmart.com or albertawater.com as well and see the results of this. And it's actually produced a roadmap for, sort of what are the 20 to 25 things that can be done to improve the resilience of our watershed here where we live in southern Alberta. And they're actually quite tangible actions, like the TransAlta deal that was done with the Alberta Environment to manage, to do storage upstream on the 11 dams that are upstream on the hydro system on the Bow. And that all came out of this collaborative work. And there's a 5-year deal in place right now that allows the government, the Alberta Environment, to do more drawing and storing to better if we have a flood or a drought situation. And similarly, now we're doing the similar kind of work on the Athabasca. And the fascinating thing about this is that, of course, the real issue on the Athabasca is what happens in the Delta, the Peace Athabasca Delta. And there's a lot of interest in that because the United Nations is very interested in that because this is a World Heritage Site. So I think we're going to see some more work in that Peace Athabasca Delta as well. And we're hoping we can have our same collaborative projects going toward that. So kind of getting into wrap up here, there's a lot of pressures on Alberta companies. And I think many of you have seen this, there's a real pressure for all industries to collaborate, not just companies within one industry, but, certainly in northwest Alberta, forestry and hydraulic fracturing guys have got to collaborate and cooperate and with the communities. So I think we're going to see that. I'm a big fan of the water conservation policy, draft October 2016. I hope they pass it. And this interesting collaboration is in there. We see a lot of legal and lobby activities, especially in oil sands, hydraulic fracturing, and of course, pipelines. There's so much focus on that on the Trans Mountain right now. And we're seeing the investors and suppliers increase pressure to show improved environmental performance. All companies are seeing that. And then within Alberta, I think we're going to continue to see water shortages in the south that are threatening fresh water availability for industry and real estate development, and that's our roadmap issue. There are agricultural guys that own farms that can sell their land and sell their water separately. But getting that water to be transferred to a non-agricultural use is not easy. And so I think we're going to continue to see that pressure, and we see it on the real estate development. Increasing demand on license holders to understand, and the GOA to understand climate impacts. And that's, I think, a lot of the cumulative effects language that we're seeing. And we see that also in the water conservation policy, as well as language coming out of the Alberta Energy Regulator. There will be, and this is the big news for the day actually, is that the water allocation system was going to be amended in some way. There's the reuse policy that's ready to be launched, the water conservation policy ready to be launched, AER pilots. And yesterday, a directive came out that we've been involved with for quite a long time from Alberta Environment on water licensing for direction for guidance for hydraulic water licenses for hydraulic fracturing. So like this is hot off the press, so it's actually in the form of a directive from Alberta Environment. This relationship between, and it gets to the next point, the relationship between the Alberta Energy Regulator and Alberta Environment and Parks. You know, I talked to the CEO of one and the deputy minister from the other one. And yeah, we're buddies, we're friends, we served in the military together. You get about 2 layers down, holy cow, there's a lot of conversations going on. And they're really working hard to try and understand this relationship. And there is a concern that they're making decisions based on policies that may no longer be relevant. And that's really clear in the hydraulic fracturing area. You know, a lot of the water policy was developed for, you know, conventional one-hole drill operations. And these are very different operations. So trying to modernize, you'll hear that language, trying to make it competitive in this new environment is very important. And again, I gave this talk just about, I don't know, not even, I think about a month ago. And, you know, Tristan Goodman was there, we're gonna change the rules. Well, as of yesterday, they actually put out some draft rules for conversation. So if you're in that business at all, it's really interesting. You can look it up. They've put that out online. So a last thought then, he knows the water best who has waded through it. And that's a fundamental of all of our work. We want to work with people that are involved in the watershed or are passionate about their watershed, who have an influence on their watershed, because they're the ones that know, and they know how to make it work. So with that, I thank you very much for the opportunity.
Awesome, thank you, Kim. Prior to the session, and whenever we do these events, we always have questions that have been pre-submitted. And in this case, one really resonated with Kim when we were chatting before this event. And so I'm gonna take my privilege in running the center and put that question forward, as it was particularly interesting for you to answer it, and was, what is the greatest risk to our valuable water resources in Canada with that filter?
So, if I could, I'm going to answer it because I know much more about the Alberta system. I think the biggest risk to our water resources here in Alberta is that we're thinking about them not holistically. We're thinking about them in silos. And I had that last week in spades when I was up in Edmonton. And you know, you talk to one guy here, and then you talk to one lady here, and one department, that. They don't talk to each other. Now, I hope nobody's offended in here that's from Alberta Environment. But you know, and they know that. They, to their credit, they're very thoughtful, very passionate people. But I think all of us, you know, we have to think of this as a holistic system. Irrigators need to talk to people from the city, need to talk to the regulator. The regulator, you know, the regulator has such great resources and technical expertise right now. Maybe they've got to lend some of that to the policy guys so that the policy and the actual on-the-ground regulation actually mesh. To me, it's thinking about water holistically is the way to get around that risk. But if we keep thinking of things linearly and only in our own pieces, it's only about me, right? It's all about me, and it's hard because water's so personal, not to personalize it, and it's about me, but trying to think of this in a holistic system. I think that's the biggest risk.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. Early on in the presentation, you identified some great statistics on water usage. You identified water in agriculture being one of the biggest users.
Yep.
And then you related that to the global crisis with the population and the potential food impact. From a policy standpoint, I would think that we as a society and government should focus on agriculture. I think our biggest impact there would be, in terms of solutions for water, would be going after the agriculture side, looking at how do we reduce the usage or recycle more, increase the yield of produce and so on. Seems like a lot of the focus has been on the oil and gas, and rightfully so, but it's such a small impact relative to the bigger one, which is agriculture. I just wanted to get your thoughts.
Yeah, no, and that's actually about 10 years ago when the oil industry, the oil sands industry, they would always, their defense was, we're not using that much water. Look at these awful ag people. Let's get these farmers under control. The logic problem on that, though, is that if you're using even one drop of water, to make an oil sands product, and you're not using it for agriculture, I mean, the world thinks that's a terrible thing. So I think switching this, I think we've done a really good job in improving our efficiency in the petroleum sector. And ag, again, the farmers, they've done a really good job. The irrigation, as I say, is a 30%. I'm pretty sure that's been in the most recent Alberta Water Council report on conservation and efficiency and productivity. It's been a big improvement, and there's still more to do. And I'm cautiously optimistic that our innovation system is now actually switching. We are observing that the innovation system is really taking a move toward looking at agricultural practices, because it isn't just the irrigation. It's also about secondary food processing. I mean, the whole value chain, right to the point where the food gets into the store, that whole piece. And that's what I think this supercluster, agricultural supercluster that Agrim is promoting for funding federally, that's the whole focus on that. How can we make more food with the same amount of water? Thank you for the question. It's a really good one.
Right here, David.
Sorry?
Thank you so much. Actually, water, when we are talking about water, there is a side of supply and demand. And like most of the dialogue at global, regional, and local, it's been like more supply-driven policies and strategies. So how about the demand management? I see less attention is being given to demand, even if we are placed here and we have plenty of water resources, but with time, we should consider as well the demand management at the household level, industry, commercial, agriculture. So where do we stand in terms of Alberta at the demand management side?
Great question. So one of the OECD keeps statistics on that. And the United States is, of course, the worst user of water per person. That shouldn't be a big surprise. We're second. So there really is an importance of demand management. Here in Alberta, the City of Calgary has actually done an outstanding job on this. They've really developed a lot of use reduction programs, and there's a reason for doing that. So I think, and Lily could probably correct me, but I think that statistics are something like the water use has gone from about 500 liters per person per year down to about, I think the last was 417 in the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, it's really coming down. Okotoks is about 330 cubic meters, liters per year annually. So we are seeing a real improvement in the statistics. But there is a way to go. And one of the reasons why we have a higher use than, let's say, some of the less agricultural intensive countries, because we are using so much water for production of food and industrial uses within our borders. But it's a really important issue. And I would recommend the City of Calgary website. It's very good in terms of encouraging people to use water more efficiently and effectively.
Hi, I'm just wondering if you can tell me whether you feel Alberta's water is known, like the amounts of water, and whether, like, if it's been geo-mapped, or the effect on like hydrological studies regarding climate change. Do you feel like I feel as if, you know, the last 40 years of the government and now the change in government, we've had a real decrease in scientific assessment of water and all the cumulative impacts that have happened. And I'm wondering if you could make me feel better about the knowledge, like say the Athabasca Glacier is decreasing, Bow Glacier is decreasing, and do we have a good handle on how much fresh water we have, where it is, and that sort of thing?
So I would like to be able to make you feel better, but okay, so I think on the, in the last decade that we've been really working on these collaborative water management studies, I think we've been able to get a much better handle on the surface water. We know nothing other than in very small pockets. And again, Dr. Fennell could speak to this. Our groundwater knowledge is abysmal. And I think if we could put, that's a place where I wish we would really have more resources put in, is better groundwater mapping. It's getting better a little bit, but a real concentrated effort to understand that is really, really important. I think on the surface, we're starting to get to be a bit better. Monitoring has always been challenging. But access to data is improving gradually, and understanding climate impacts is getting better. And I think we're way better off now than we were, say, 10 years ago, but we still have a massive gap in our groundwater knowledge. I mean, it's getting a little bit better, but compared to like California, we know nothing. They know, a lot, so. Yeah.
Thanks, Kim, for waving the banner for groundwater. I really appreciate that. If I can say, just to follow up on that, I know that Alberta Innovates did a study. I was involved with that back in 2011, I think is when it finished, and there was an inventory of groundwater resources done in the province, albeit it was a very preliminary and high level, but it was an attempt to actually answer that question. But you're right. I mean, we do need a little bit more effort in the underground mapping. That costs money, obviously, and right now Alberta's got other issues they have to deal with that are a higher priority. But my question to you, Kim, first of all, I just wanted to thank you for doing the presentation today. It's always great to get a bit more insight out there as far as water is concerned. You and I have been involved in that for our careers. I would like the question I'd like to ask is a little bit more broader. It has to do with the concept of sustainability and how do we reach sustainability. Where does awareness and literacy come into that? And where do you think, on average, Canadians stand with their water literacy, and where would Alberta fall in that spectrum?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people, because water comes out of the tap, they take it for granted. I think that's a pretty common piece. If it impacts you personally, you know a lot about it. Dr. Lauren Taylor, a very been a great mentor of mine, but he always talks about the water in the dugouts, when he was growing up, and his dad would take him to the dugout and show, here's where the cows have to drink. And when you see it, that it's a very visceral, personal thing. I think you get a lot more understanding about it, but on average, I think, folks that live kind of in the city and just turn on the tap and the water comes out and pay your bill, and they don't even actually know what their bill is, right, because it's buried in all sorts of other stuff, that there is an issue about literacy. That said, I think here in Alberta, we're really working hard. There's a lot of folks in the room, Ellen's here, who are really working at and improving that literacy. We actually, this is one of the things, our not-for-profit, our charity, the Alberta Water Portal Society, was formed specifically to help with that literacy and awareness and providing facts and figures so that people can make their own choices. I think one of the things that is so go on it. I'm not allowed to push my causes, but this one is a great one. So if you go onto albertawater.com, you can find out everything you want to know about water. But I think we are getting better in terms of literacy, and it's becoming, because we've had the floods. The best thing that happened to us in terms of water awareness was that flood. I mean, because now the city guys saw the problem, right? And they hadn't seen it before. The farmers have always known it because they're, they see drought a lot. But now the city folks got to see it, and we saw a big uptake on that. For what it's worth, if you've gone through that like we did, I think it all of a sudden becomes much more personal, and we've seen an increase in awareness. A lot more questions anyway, if that can be the indicator of awareness.
Hi, Kim. Can you tell us a little bit about WaterNext and how it differs from other accelerators in the province and how we in the water technology industry and oil and gas and agri can get involved?
Yeah, great. We can go see John Van Ham over here, who's on our board of that. The reason why we started WaterNext, frankly, was because of the increase in inquiries on water technology. And people had lots of water ideas, which is another indication that people are starting to think about it. There's been a noticeable increase in the last 10 years on interest on water technologies. And so one of the pieces about being well known in the field is if you've got a water idea, go see Kim. I'm pretty sure quite a few in the room have done that and sent them over. Right? Yeah. And so we've really been inundated with requests for information, sort of what is this technology, how does it work, and from companies who say, I want to test something, but I'm not 100% sure if it might work or not, to entrepreneurs saying, is this idea able to fill a need? So we've actually set up a separate organization, a not-for-profit, to focus on really doing that vetting of technologies, both from a technology point of view, a market point of view, and whether, whether it's got a fit and can work. So this is we just launched this 2 or 3 months ago, but the difference would be that we're not really going to be spending a whole lot of time. There's all sorts of people out there that like Innovate Calgary and so many others that can help companies grow. Ours is to make sure that they're growing with something that someone will actually want to buy. And so there'll be a lot of international collaboration on that as well. So if you want to get involved, go online and put up your hand. And it'll be good. Up at the University Research Center. So.
Great, thank you. I know I feel better now.
Good.
So with that, I just want to give you a little thank you gift, and if you could join me in thanking Kim for her time today.
Good. Great, thank you.